Robert Mogielnicki, it's April 18, 2023. Welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Listen, you have spent a great deal of time looking at free zones, at the GCC, and that architecture. How do you assess the significance, the importance, and the weight of GCC's infrastructure in free economic zones and its importance to China's Belt Road Initiative and expansion strategy?
Sure, it's a great question. I guess to kick things off, we can look at economic zones, whether they're special economic zones or free zones or some other variation. You have a lot of different, various terminology. That's all roughly equates to very similar entities. Those economic zones are important parts of the economic and the maritime dimensions of the BRI. This is at least the idea and the view that we get if you look at any number of official documents from Chinese government sources, the Arab Policy Paper, and other documents that expound on the Belt and Road Initiative. So we know that there is something there, that these economic zones are important nodes in the BRI. So working off of that, if you want to look across the Middle East and North Africa for the areas that have the highest concentration of economic zones, that search is going to lead you to GCC countries, and in particular, the UAE. And then if we wanted to even go beyond that on a subnational level, you would look at Dubai, which has roughly half of the country's 40 plus special economic zones. I think they're up to about 44 special economic zones. And I mean, at this point, I would say it really is important to differentiate between the special economic zones that are attached to ports and that have an important, maritime component, and then the economic zones that are, further inland, that are focused on industries and sectors that may to some degree utilize, re-export through, by maritime means, but are not necessarily connected to ports or even are dealing with imports and exports. I mean, you have kind of zones focused on digital services, cross-border overland trade, and the like. So that again gets us back to where I started with. You've got an important kind of overland dimension and maritime dimension for these economic zones. So yeah, I think the big takeaway, and then I'll turn it back over to you to ask the next question here, is the economic zones are important. Identifying the regional focus of that importance brings you to the GCC states. In particular, the UAE. This is the country that specialized in economic zones for a number of years and has the highest number of zones. But there are other countries, like Oman, for example, has a handful of special economic zones, around 5 by my last count. And we know that a number of Chinese firms have invested in these zones. Sometimes their commitments have not lived up to their commitments, and we can talk about that with respect to Duqm. And then I would look towards Saudi Arabia as well. This is a country that traditionally has a number of economic cities and major industrial development parks, but is only now launching a number of zones. Just a couple of days ago, Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Investment announced 4 new special economic zones, one of which is focused on cloud computing, which then can bring us to beyond the overland and the maritime components of the BRI, but to the digital Silk Road, the technology-focused dimension of the BRI as well. So we'll spend a lot of time today, I believe, talking about the GCC. The one caveat here that I'd like to add is I see Egypt's special economic zone sector also being very important to the BRI, precisely because the maritime components of the BRI, that really the only maritime component that truly cuts through the Middle East goes through the Red Sea corridor and passes the Suez Canal and into the Mediterranean. And that puts Egypt, and especially the Special Economic Zone runs along the Suez Canal, in a very good position to kind of exploit this relationship and this Chinese-driven global development initiative that we know as the BRI.
That's perfect, Robert, because you've now unpacked about 6 of my questions that I'm gonna start debating.
Well, we can dig deeper into each one.
Let's start with the very last point that you've made regarding the Suez Canal, and you're right, absolutely significant. I'm reading now kind of intelligence reports that talk about this closer cooperation between China and Iraq, financed by the UAE, to take an alternative path through Fao Peninsula up through Iraq to Turkey, and as a medium-term strategy to find a way of bypassing the Suez Canal completely. Now, there are a lot of these kinds of fogs of war out there on so many of these issues. But it's not unprecedented because, of course, India has also talked to the UAE and Israel about creating an alternative route into the Mediterranean via Haifa and then up to Europe. So obviously something is cooking, that the Suez Canal and Bab al-Mandab at the other end, of course, neither are particularly secure choke points, and that parties you're looking at Eurasia are looking for alternatives. And given that Russia is now a vacuum, they're obviously looking at bypasses. Do you give any credit to these alternatives? Not in the short term, in the medium term.
I haven't looked specifically at those reports that you mentioned regarding kind of UAE funded activities in Iraq, but the idea makes sense to me in this way, that it's not, to me, just about the choke points and the vulnerabilities associated with choke points. Sure, you could imagine Chinese firms utilizing these trade routes, these supply chains that use the maritime and the overland routes. They want options, and options are good, especially if you're looking at areas that do have choke points in a region of the world that is, that knows instability and is familiar with disruptions and conflicts as well. But I would probably look at this. I would probably tackle your question by thinking about the regional economic interests at play, because if we're looking at the Suez Canal and the regional players who have the largest economic interest in that Suez Canal Red Sea corridor continuing to be a central component of the BRI are Egypt, first and foremost, because of the Suez Canal. But then if you move south, Saudi Arabia and its burgeoning, economic development activity that in many respects is kind of is proliferating along its Red Sea coast. You have the NEO mega project, you have the Red Sea Development Company, you have a number of other commercial hubs, some new and some established along the Red Sea. And a lot of what Saudi Arabia is doing is trying to ensure a balanced approach to development, and the Red Sea corridor is an important part of that. And as you move down, also potentially Oman stands to benefit quite a bit from the continued importance of this Red Sea corridor, because they have the Salalah port and free zone, Duqm as well. Moving a little bit further down the coast would be an important part of that corridor and all of the commercial trade that goes around it. Now, if we start thinking about a country like the GCC, a country like the UAE has a tremendous amount of special economic zones, but that corridor in the Persian Gulf leads nowhere at the moment. So I can understand potential recalibrations and reconfigurations of different economic partnerships that utilize a combination of maritime and overseas components to reconfigure BRI related activities in a way that actually would benefit a country like the UAE more so than it would Saudi Arabia and Oman and Iraq as well. We know Iraq Iraq is a country that certainly depends quite extensively on Chinese imports of Iraqi hydrocarbon commodities, but I think there is a well understood concern within Iraq that dependence upon China, primarily on an energy front, is not a sustainable one, and it leaves Iraq and its economy in a relatively vulnerable position. So I can certainly understand efforts and intentions to kind of diversify economic relations in a way that ultimately is more in line with Iraq's economic interests.
But from China's perspective, are they
Sure.
just hedging from your view, or are they just multiplying their options? Because of course, from the regional perspective, the last thing they want is another divide and rule power coming into the region, right? So,
Yeah.
so if you're sitting in Saudi Arabia and you get wind of this UAE, Iraqi, Chinese cooperation, as you say, the Saudis are investing elsewhere already. What do they make of it all?
It does depend a little bit on how you think about the BRI and how you define the BRI. There are those who define the BRI as primarily a quest to support, China's energy security. And I mean, there are some who focus on energy security. I don't think that's the totality of it. But I mean, if your launching point is that perspective, securing kind of energy security and reducing vulnerabilities associated with kind of global supply chains upon which Chinese firms depend upon, then of course you're sitting in Beijing, you're going to try to look for options. You're going to look to reduce those vulnerabilities. I think relatively recent events of major ships clogging the Suez Canal for a number of days, I think certainly would give many of these policymakers pause and make them think carefully about potentially being overly dependent upon the Suez Canal. And I think that from that perspective, certainly would force them to look for other options. But I don't see there being an urgent need to shift away necessarily from the Suez Canal. And I look at the BRI as a very fuzzy global development initiative that in many respects is a way to categorize bilateral relationships, and that it's a convenient term. It's in many respects it's a branding initiative. It's terminology that is used very pragmatically and very effectively by a number of Chinese actors, government actors and business actors to create and strengthen and then secure down the line commercial linkages and other business opportunities. So from that perspective, I don't see a strong adherence necessarily to the exact overland and maritime corridors as they stand now. I think that from my view of the BRI, it creates a lot of opportunities going forward to reconfigure some of these linkages into ideally in a way that expands them and increases business opportunities for Chinese companies.
Robert, you touched on this race of 44 economic zones in UAE alone, 5 announced in Saudi Arabia and Oman and all of that. And they're mostly called FEZs, Free Economic Zones. And it's one thing to call something a name, it's another thing to be something as effective and efficiency. I can call myself Brad Pitt, but that doesn't make me Brad Pitt. So aren't there a number of free economic zombies, to stick to the zones, in the region with huge investments and very little traffic and trade? And in that context, isn't the weight on the shoulders of DP World and Dubai, particularly, or UAE for that matter, for the reconstruction opportunity of Iraq and Syria and Saudi Arabia's foreign minister today was in Damascus. So the whole reconstruction, and isn't that part of the equation of China and Belt Road Initiative for the reconstruction of war-torn economies and countries?
Yeah, so a two-part question, I guess. I mean, what exactly does the Gulf's free zone sector look like? How should we think about it? And then the second part is maybe how does that play into Chinese ambitions for and business opportunities related to reconstruction? As for the first point, I wouldn't say so much that there are free zone zombies, but rather describe it as there are certain free zones that take up a disproportionate degree of commercial activity. So there are really like heavyweights and the little league players in the free zone sector. So if you take a country like the UAE, for example, the heavyweight is Jebel Ali free zone. I mean, if you take the figures, top line figures, Jebel Ali free zone is pulling, by many accounts, the majority of the free zone sector's weight. In terms of FDI, in terms of kind of re-exports, in terms of the value of goods that are coming through. So, I mean, you have like a superstar, and then you have a whole bunch, a much larger sector. As I said, it's, I think, around 44 or 45 free zones in total in the country. Many of them are involved in much smaller niche trades. You do have a couple of other kind of middleweight, so to speak, the Dubai Multi-Commodity Center, the Dubai Airport Free Zone. You have the Khalifa Industrial Zone, Abu Dhabi, in Abu Dhabi. You have the Dubai International Financial Center, which is really important, financial free zone, and in many respects, as a kind of sister organization, the Abu Dhabi Global Market. And these what I would classify as kind of middleweights, pulling their weight, but not necessarily to the degree as Jebel Ali. And then you have a whole bunch of smaller zones.
Robert, I was talking about zombies outside of UAE in specific, not within UAE. So
sure. Oh, so in neighboring countries?
Yeah.
I mean, a great example of this would be the Duqm Special Economic Zone, because I mean, as many of us will know and we've heard about Duqm many times at conferences and many of the articles we've read about. And if I come across a figure that says that the Chinese have invested $10.7 billion in the Duqm Special Economic Zone, I mean, I immediately stop reading the article, because these were investment pledges for a joint China and Oman industrial zone within Duqm. And, something has materialized. You can see now there are plans for around 30 companies on the website, but very, very little of that initial investment pledge has materialized. I think from a perspective of looking at the Duqm Special Economic Zone as a key hub in China's BRI, this has absolutely not happened. Even as a key hub for Chinese investment in the region, definitely not happened. But the Omani government is very keen to prevent Duqm from becoming a white elephant, or a zombie, so to speak, economic zombie. So you'll still see the government, propping up that special economic zone and supporting it. But I don't think that the Chinese investors and Chinese support will play a big role in that, at least for the time being. As I mentioned before, if Saudi Arabia's special economic zone sector really accelerates and we see a lot more activity taking place in that Red Sea corridor, I do think that will give a boost to Omani special economic zones around on the medium term. But then there are a whole bunch of special economic zones, new ones coming online, that do have a digital component. So as I mentioned, the new special economic zones in Saudi Arabia, there were 4 announced. To say that they're new is a little bit of a misnomer. They're kind of special economic zone status slapped on top of existing economic initiatives, whether they're economic cities or what have you. But that being said, there's one that is focused on cloud computing in Riyadh. And we also saw UAE, a new special economic zone, I believe in Ras Al Khaimah, which focuses on digital currencies and cryptocurrencies. Again, niche industries, but I think there's a lot of potential there to draw in companies that we might classify as supporting the technology focused dimension of the BRI or the digital Silk Road. Countries like Saudi Arabia in particular are really desperate for foreign investment, want to boost their FDI numbers. And I believe that, Chinese companies, especially multinational technology firms, are going to be, a key focus for Saudi Arabia's FDI efforts going forward.
Robert, interesting that you've mentioned DOM. Of course, the irony is when China showed interest in DOM, it ensured that United States, British, and Japanese Navy, all of them, will subscribe to using DOM. As you know, it's Arabian Peninsula's deepest natural seaport. That, as a consequence, they now service their warships in DOM, which is providing a reasonable substitute for what China might or might have not committed to doing DOM. So, using the Chinese phrase, it's a win-win from the money perspective. But on the questions of free trade zones, the thing that kind of makes alarm bells go off in my brain is regulation.
Right.
That and there have been some kind of news coming out of some of these free zones, UAE in particular, have been doing stuff which don't seem to be completely low compliant, let's call it. And if the assumption is that China is going to pour into these with money and other kinds of resources, where does regulation sit in all of these if the countries themselves don't have the regulatory mechanisms to make sure that there is a broad international compliance?
Well, yeah, there are two sides. There are 2 to 3 different ways to look at that question. There are one side of it is to look at how do U.S. and European regulators look at these special economic zones, the rules and the regulations in particular in these special economic zones, and how does that potentially impact relations between the Emiratis and say folks in Brussels or in Washington. That's one side of things. The other side is what's the actual strategy within these countries? How are officials and why are officials creating regulations in this way? There are different views to that, which I'll get to in just a moment. And just to round it out, you've got to look at it from the other side of things in terms of the demand side of things. What about the regulations in special economic zones across the Gulf is attractive to foreign investors, whether they're Chinese or they're Russian or they're from another part of the globe? And I think we see some investors caring more about regulation than others. And that really depends in many respects where those foreign investors are coming from. With, I think, at the moment, the kind of Russian investors being a lot less concerned, wanting very lax regulatory environments. Chinese to some degree, not caring about regulation for regulation's sake, but as we know, Chinese companies have been very sensitive to sanctions-related concerns. And so, I wouldn't want to suggest that that Chinese investors and Chinese companies are simply looking for completely regulatory, very lax regulatory environments. I think it's they're business people just like anyone else, and they're concerned about a regulatory environment that aligns with their interests. Let's just put it that way. Those are the different perspectives we really must consider. You get some analysts and other observers who look at the very varied regulatory environment that we find in a country like the UAE. You have several different emirates. You have free zones in each emirate. Many of those free zones have their own authorities. Those authorities create, in some cases, rules and regulations that are contradictory or do not align perfectly. The end result of all of these varied levels of regulations is that it does create a very complicated commercial landscape. And there are a lot of opportunities for illicit actors to take advantage of that complicated commercial landscape and in particular, find ways to conduct illicit activities under the radar or to obscure, the original source of funding that they may come to the country with, or other, just there are whole types, money laundering, illicit financial flows, and the whole gamut. Now, that happens everywhere. I mean, that happens here in the US, that happens in London. But the big question is, what is the role of these regulatory environments? And is this a kind of strategy to attract a certain type of business that might be more interested, that might be more aligned with, illicit actors globally? I kind of take a middle of the ground approach. As I just explained, I will admit that this landscape, this economic landscape, that is kind of the sum total of a free zone-led economic development strategy, does create a lot of opportunities for illicit actors. But I don't think that that is the strategy, so to speak, the development strategy. The special economic zone sector is the culmination of several decades of development in the UAE. I mean, started in the 80s. And has moved forward across a number of different, political leaders, and the elites around them, and also proliferated within various emirates, all of which maintain a certain degree of economic autonomy afforded by the Constitution. And we see that as well in other countries too. I'm not just talking about the UAE. So I think it would be very, very complicated to have a multi-decade long cohesive strategy, never mind a very risky one, to create a regulatory environment that is geared towards attracting, malicious actors. But then again, so I don't think that's the case, but I do say, I think it's important to recognize that landscape is attractive to those actors, and regulators play an important role in being on the front line to stop this type of activity, these kind of illicit activities. Now, to what degree Chinese companies are concerned about that, I think the main concern has to do with sanctions, to the U.S. sanctions. And honestly, I would say, as long as Chinese companies are assured that by registering in a professional free zone in a place like the UAE or in another Gulf country, that they're going to steer clear of any kind of sanctions related exposure, then I think beyond that, the regulations are not as much of a concern beyond the typical ones you would expect. I mean, these companies, they want to maintain full foreign ownership of their companies. They want lax labor regulations, mainly to import their own labor or to utilize local labor at a cheaper cost. And they want, tax and duty exemptions, so the kind of primarily economic considerations and commercial considerations, not so much reputational ones.
Robert, thank you for that. It reminded me of 50 Shades of Grey, but 50 Shades of Grey regulation. So on that note, you've written nicely in the past about closed-door discussions and through private diplomacy in the bigger context of China and West, a race for influence in the region. Do you think that the region is developing a selective hearing syndrome towards the voices of US and Europe as it diversifies? And is the shift of petrodollars and this, zero, emissions world, which is just a farce? Because I don't know if the both of you saw it, RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, is the largest financier of fossil fuels just last year. And if you look at that, so this net zero has come back to be a little bit of a hot topic. And with that element of interdependency of China and the region, do you think that this private diplomacy that you were talking about is starting to even in the private context, that we love you, but we have to diversify and we are strategically aligning with China?
Yes, we hear a lot of that view here at our institute, and we look at part of our role at the institute is to explain why that perception in the Gulf, this idea that we live in an increasingly multipolar world and Gulf governments need to ensure that they have diversified global relationships with a wide range of partners, including the Chinese, including Russia, including a number of countries, in addition to their kind of traditional partnerships with the U.S. and European partners and others. That view is one that is quite commonly heard these days. And I mean, to some extent, we can understand how and why that serves the interests of government officials in the region. I think the bigger problem, or the nuance to that discussion, is that despite the kind of talking points and the rhetoric, it's very clear that not all Middle Eastern, if we're talking Gulf governments, but also we could broaden it out to say the kind of Middle East and North African governments, feel as comfortable promoting their ties with China in a way that is very clearly designed to, to reflect kind of strained relations with the U.S. And for this, I would refer to kind of rolling out the red carpets for President Xi in December, a few months after a very kind of tense meeting or visit of the U.S. president to the region. The kind of Beijing brokered deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran that had been in the works for a number of for a number of years, and many believe to be, in some respects, kind of a freebie given to Beijing to kind of help push that agreement over the finish line. And then the kind of formalizing participation as a dialogue partner. This was at least Saudi Arabia in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. To be fair, all of these processes had been in the works for some time, and is not shouldn't be treated as a series of developments that represent a clear and immediate pivot away from the U.S. But one does, when you look at the totality of all of these actual steps and developments, and then you listen to what regional officials are saying about their relationships and the importance of kind of global relationships and the comprehensive strategic partnership with China. This is at least for Saudi Arabia and the UAE. One does get the sense of, hey, you could be inclined to believe that these countries are realigning their relationships and moving more so in the camp, firmly planting their one foot in Beijing's camp. But I think it would be a mistake to apply that across the broader Middle East and North Africa. It seems quite clear to me that Saudi Arabia at the moment is the most eager country to move ahead in this fashion and to really make a show of relations with China, to really show the kind of positive and warm ties and the synergies with the relationship with China, and actually to also promote and to make public some of the tensions that they have with the U.S. I don't see the Saudis being at all interested in rupturing the relationship with the U.S. And I think at the end of the day, they will be quite careful to make sure that relationship remains intact. But there's no doubt they're really pushing ahead and to strengthen relations with China. And I would say that there isn't. I mean, I focus on political economy a lot, and I see a strong economic interest underlying those ties. That Saudi Arabia needs foreign direct investment. It needs, major global, trading partners like the Chinese, and needs the kind of continuation, needs to be at the center of many of these massive flows of people and goods and technologies across the globe. That's exactly what Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman, that's where he wants his country be in the future, to be really at the center of East and West, and be a hub for global tourists. Be a hub for global professionals, be a major investment hub. And, I think that he will get some of that from the US, and he will get some of that from Europe, but it's not going to get him anywhere close to his achieving his very grandiose ambitions. He's going to have to bring a lot of that capital and tourists and business people and firms. He's going to have to attract them from Asia as well, and in particular China. So I see China as being a really important part of that broader economic transformation dilemma that confronts MBS, or dilemma in a negative sense, challenge, or opportunity in a more positive sense. I'll just end by saying that I don't see the other countries many of the other countries in the Middle East and North Africa being as willing to toe that line. Sure, they'll show up at a summit in December. They'll send representation, but if you speak to many of the diplomats here in Washington from other Middle Eastern countries, they're very concerned about that approach, that very kind of aggressive, kind of pro-Beijing stance. And they're not so sure that they want to conduct their relationship, or to make a show of their relationship in a way that would strain ties unnecessarily with partners in Washington, and even to some degree European partners as well. I think the UAE is one country where it's somewhat on the fence. If you look at the ways that that the UAE is engaging with China, there's no doubt they have a very strong economic partnership. But we haven't seen the Emiratis going to the same lengths that the Saudis have to promote the nature of their ties, even though they have a comprehensive strategic partnership. To use China to broker agreements. We're not seeing that. Even their participation in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization doesn't, as far as I know, rise to the level of Saudi Arabia and some other countries. So again, I think these countries think China's important. Many of these countries think China's an important economic partner. There are some areas beyond the economic realm where we can collaborate, but they're going to be very cautious in kind of moving into those realms.
That's absolutely brilliant, Robert, in terms of unpacking what is an ongoing concern from a regional, but also from international perspective. It's kind of the world turned on its head. We had imperial powers that colonized and then bust through economic domination, and we now have China, which is coming through economic relations, but we assume that it's going to turn into an imperial ambition, and frankly, we don't know. We are nowhere near where making that kind of gross assumptions about China. But what is clear is that as a magnet, China is pulling these countries, and also inevitably as the world's second largest economy, which produces everything that we consume anywhere on the planet, inevitably they have to work with China, right? That is the reality of it. But looking at the GCC itself, you've wisely written about this. We talk about an uneven Middle East, but actually GCC itself is very uneven. We talked about Dome as one example of that. So we see these clear patterns emerging with China, Saudi Arabia, China, Emirates, China, Qatar over LNG and so on. Mm-hmm. And yet some of the oldest relationships are with a country like Kuwait. We hear very little about where Bahrain fits in all of this and so on. And then there are the other two ugly sisters, Iran and Iraq on the other side. So one, is there a competition amongst the GCC countries? And second, how do the GCC countries view this warming of relations between Iran, Saudi Arabia, with China as the patron of it, and the dark horse, Iraq itself? Is there a sense of cooperation or competition, or just passive acceptance?
Yeah, the most useful way for me to measure Chinese government and economic interest in the Gulf region, so GCC plus Iraq and Iran, is simply to look at two figures: investment flows over the past, historical investment flows from China into the region, and trade figures. And what you will find is that, roughly speaking, the largest countries in terms of GDP and population-wise, so the biggest countries in terms of, as I said, GDP, but also as potential markets, these are the main focus points for Chinese economic engagement in the region. Very rarely do you see a country that doesn't have a large market or is not a major economy within the region popping up as kind of an important kind of focus point for either the Chinese government efforts or Chinese commercial efforts in the region. It's pretty, you make a list and you start with the largest economies and move down. And I mean, that by and large, I think is the best measure, if there is any, of where Chinese officials place their chips when they're making bets on long-term partnerships within the region. And that's why Saudi Arabia is right at the top. It's received the most investments. It's among the UAE and Saudi Arabia have kind of, and Turkey is a big trade partner as well because of its market. But UAE and Saudi Arabia are big trade partners. A lot of the UAE's trade is coming from re-export. So you have to work that into your calculation. And then, of course, Iran and Iraq are important, are important energy partners as well. But there are huge asymmetries in those relationships. So, China is hugely important for Iran, hugely important for Iraq, not very important at all, I would wager, for China. You see a similar asymmetry with Oman, whereas if you look back for the last few years, there are many months where Oman sends a majority of its crude oil exports to China. We're talking 80, 85, 90%. But really, Omani crude oil is just a small sliver of what China imports in any given any given day or month. We're talking kind of single digits, and this resonates a lot with this asymmetry in these partnerships. Resonates a lot with what I've heard Chinese officials say, that they are sensitive to disruptions from energy trade in the Middle East, but they're not vulnerable in the sense of they do not rely on one country beyond 10 to 15% of their imports. And even if there is some major crisis, they can shift to other forms of energy. They can utilize coal. They can utilize a number of other sources of energy to mitigate those disruptions. So again, I mean, there are this whole core of countries as we move away from those big economies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE that fall into that category where they're important energy partners. But the problem is there's just this asymmetry in the relationship, which a country like Iraq and Iran and Oman, they're just never really going to be able to overcome. And I think that's why you will see a lot of hesitation in Iraq about becoming too dependent upon Chinese investments. And in some cases, Iraq's government has actually blocked acquisitions in the energy sector by Chinese firms. In Oman, you see many investors and many government officials who have, by and large, kind of given up on big ambitions for Chinese investments. I mean, they'll welcome it if it comes down the line, but they just said we hope that it would materialize, and it didn't. So we're going to focus on our partnerships, in the UK, strong partnerships in the UK with US companies and with Indian companies, for example, and Japan as well. I think is a big focus for Oman. Some of the other players, like Kuwait, these are countries, Kuwait and Qatar, they're not comprehensive strategic partners with China. They're just they're just strategic partners. So I think there's certainly economic relations in a narrow sense, largely in the energy sector, and those will continue. But in some respect, I think we have to treat those partnerships with a grain of salt. The Qatari-China partnership was basically put on hold during, the tense splintering of the GCC in recent years, with China essentially just siding with the larger economies, the Saudi Arabia and the UAE, saying these are important markets. We're not going to give them up because of Qatar. And with Kuwait, I mean, Kuwait's potentially an important kind of ideological partner and important for kind of influencing perceptions of China's role in the world as it pertains, as it permeates within the Middle East. So I see a lot of that relationship kind of transcending the economics and moving into kind of other social spheres. Bahrain's just a small player. There's really not much. If you look at the economic relations, even on an energy front, between China, there's really not much there. So they don't even have a strategic partnership. So that if we just run that full range, you see that there is an incredible variation in economic ties to China. And Some cases asymmetry, some cases a strong and robust economic relationship, and in some cases either a very tenuous economic relationship or very little relationship at all.
Robert, you've talked in the past about Chinese influence in the region will be at the national and subnational level.
Yeah.
Yet most of the countries around Persian Gulf to the north and to the south are run in a top-down fashion. Where is that subnational conversation taking place, in your view? With who? At what level with Chinese?
So, I mean, you could look at a subnational level taking place in the UAE, and that's always as writing about the region and wanting to tick your boxes. You have to make sure that you're finding some pithy way to include the fact that you have many different emirates in the UAE, some of which are engaging, whether it's Dubai or Abu Dhabi, engaging at a kind of with partners, global partners on a subnational level. So sometimes we're writing that just to kind of make sure we're ticking our boxes. But the subnational dimension is also important when we think about economic linkages, because I speak with this. I try to encourage my students a lot to move away from just talking about China and try to define what you're actually talking about. Are these government actors in Beijing? Are these companies you're talking about? Are they government-related entities, sovereign wealth funds, provincial development companies? There are a number of different actors, and once you force yourself to grapple with, well, who exactly is this actor I'm talking about? Are we talking about government or talking about business? And in many cases, there's a relationship between the two. And then you define that. That's going to influence how that particular actor engages within the Middle East and North Africa. So, many of the large, multi-billion-dollar agreements in places like Duqm or Kazad, or traders markets in Jebel Ali free zone, those have been pushed forward and advanced by provincial development companies from China. And I think that while many of the governments, whether it's in Beijing or in the UAE, are certainly kind of, I'm sure, are being made aware of these investments, are in support of them in many cases, that for the most part, a lot of these linkages are happening at what we could call a meso level. I mean, firm to firm, or they're being initiated by kind of, certain investments ministry, for example, in Dubai, or even an investment authority that's attached to one of the free zones. Some of these linkages as well are being initiated by sovereign wealth funds now in the Gulf. A number of them have branch offices in China and are organically creating relationships and forming linkages between different companies in China and in their home countries, looking for entrepreneurs in their local environments, whether that's in China or in the other direction as well. A lot of these ties, it's tempting and it's easy to just say, oh, this is a reflection of China UAE relations, but then that in many cases is not very accurate. We have to push ourselves to dig a little bit deeper, and that's a great thing about academia. You have more time and space to explore and explain the nuances of these relationships than sometimes we wish we had in the think tank world.
Well, listen, you have helped us to dig deep today, and we wanted to thank you with that. But my last question in all of our BRI dialogues to our guests is that if you were to leave one piece of advice for the Cinefolks, what that advice would be, and if you were to leave one piece of advice for Cinephiles, what would that advice be? Cinephobes
and Cinephiles, huh? That's a good question. I wish I had some. I wish that I had a little bit of time to prepare. One bit of advice would be for the more skeptical and concerned parties in that equation is read academic historically focused studies of Chinese relations in the Middle East and North Africa. I think one has to put all of these recent developments and the acceleration of Chinese, Middle East, and North African relations into a historical perspective to really understand what's going on. And I know everyone says they don't have time to read, and they don't have time to read books, and they certainly don't have time to read long academic investigations, but that's fine. But if you don't have time to do that, then don't make time to comment on the significance of recent developments. That's, for me, has been very helpful in teaching, having to have a module and multiple courses that look at a longer history of Chinese relations with the region and how those ties have evolved over time, and the interests that were at the front and center of ties have evolved and changed, and in many cases, disappeared. Maybe to come back. We're starting to hear about non-aligned movements again. So maybe they will. Some of these types of concepts and ideas don't completely die. Maybe they come back and are reincarnated. We'll see. So that would be one for the Cinephiles. I'd say that at least within the Middle East and North Africa, there are still, I'd say, a lot of opportunities in this space. There are opportunities to watch, to observe, to inform. If you're an analyst and a kind of a critic and an observer like myself, but also if you're kind of moving in the other direction, you're looking at them. If you're based in Beijing or Shanghai, I think you'll increasingly find a very open and interested audience in the Middle East and North Africa for some time. If you're willing to support and enhance linkages between China and the region in a way that maybe was more complicated and more difficult in previous decades. I think that this is a period where there's a number of people can really build relations and create economic opportunities for themselves, despite the consternation that might cause here in Washington and some European capitals.
We are fully aware of those consternations that echo across the Atlantic. Robert, I'm going to be politically incorrect and say not only are you handsome, but you're also wise and extremely articulate in the way that you have responded to our queries and the depth in which you've engaged with us. I think the knowledge that you echo is extraordinary. And the finer issues that you focused on are really important because, as you say, there is a tendency to look at these at a kind of abstract almost level of engagement, but you actually brought them to life in terms of these are individuals who run corporations, regions, states even, who are articulating interests from their own very particular points of view. And we are dealing with the consequences of all of those interactions. And your work exemplifies your approach of, if you like, a articulated through a human level interaction, but also very well informed in terms of understanding of historical forces that underpin the current developments across Asia. And the fact that you're sitting out in Washington is really important because the people, both Cinephiles and Cinephiles, need to hear and read and listen to what you have to say. And that's why we are really delighted to have had you on our program, because here you are for them to learn from at no cost. They can listen to you at any time that they want and actually educate themselves with the key issues that you've so well presented to us. So thank you very much, Robert.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you. I learned from the best. Your books and works are a regular feature of my syllabus on China-Middle East relations. So yeah, on behalf of myself and my students, we thank you for that, for the insights as well. So
thank you, Robert, for joining us.
All right.